This is Dimitri Lascaris reporting for The Real News from the United Nations Climate Change Conference COP21 in Paris, France. Earlier today, I discussed the status of the negotiations and where things are going to go from here with Elizabeth May. Elizabeth May is the leader of the Green Party of Canada and the only sitting member of the Canadian Parliament who is from the Green Party. In the interest of full disclosure, I myself ran for the Green Party in the most recent federal election. Here's what Elizabeth May had to say about where we currently stand and where things are heading.
So you're part of a delegation here involving members of the Canadian government, opposition parties, provincial governments, some 250 members of that delegation. Yeah. Could you describe for us a little bit what role you get to play in that large posse?
Well, what we do is actually, it's good. There's a number of us on the delegation that are COP veterans, if you will. So there's a very, very expert group of environmental activists, Louise Cremo for Climate Action Network, Stephen Guilbeault from Equiterre, Dale Marshall with Environmental Defense. So there's a group of non-government organizations that, like me, are doing deep detail text work on the draft treaty. And we meet with the minister's chief of staff, the minister when she's here, and lead negotiators and say, okay, what are you doing on this? What are you doing on that? Can we move you on this? Can we move you on that? So we're actually having a really good dialogue that's a private conversation, but trying to get our government delegation to do the best possible job to get the best possible treaty. And that relationship right now I described as pretty positive. And then there's a larger group of the delegation, youth members, indigenous groups, labor unions, and all that. And they're also very involved, but they're not as involved in detailed text work. They want to know what's going on. So then there's a second briefing, which involves the government delegation explaining and answering questions. So everybody's involved at the level of which their personal expertise can take them. And I think that's a really good thing. The delegation, one of the reasons, I was just answering a question, I did a FaceTime interview with one of the main national networks, and they're saying, well, the delegation is so large. I thought, boy, listen, hello. And I actually said to them, look, the national media should have registered itself through the UN process and gotten accreditation as media. I've never before seen such a thing. That there were about 20 members of our delegation, the Canadian government delegation, that were Globe and Mail, CTV, CBC. They just hadn't bothered at all to pay attention to the fact that the COP was going to happen, because they haven't been paying attention to COPs during the Harper era. Right. No, I mean, like it was like we've gone through almost 10 years in which climate wasn't an issue enough that our national media even knew the rules of how to get yourself accredited to come to a UN conference to cover climate. So they got themselves added to the delegation, thus making it about 20 people bigger, and then said, well, the delegation looks rather large. I find it rather, you can see the irony.
Right. And so now you're at a stage where I understand the first ministers are going to be coming under the environment ministers. And I also understand that the text has been slimmed down to some 21 pages.
No, it's still 46. 46 pages within which there are 500 areas of disagreement.
All right, so I'm going to try to simplify this. In order, from your perspective and taking a broad view, what is it that we don't have yet agreement on, that we're going to need to get agreement on in order to remain within the 2 degrees Celsius limit?
Almost everything, and I'm not prepared to exceed to 2 degrees yet. I'm pushing really hard, and a lot of the delegates on the Canadian delegation want to see Canada be a country that says, look, let's leave 1.5 degrees in the text. Let's make sure we understand that 2 degrees is not a safe zone, it's a danger area, and to avoid 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need much more rapid reduction of emissions. To avoid 2 degrees is, as you say, challenging. Your question suggests it's challenging to avoid 2. But right now, the cumulative impact of all the promises made by all governments, if they kept all their promises, would be to go to 3.7 degrees. So the key things in this treaty, and just about there's nothing currently agreed upon, but the key things that we must get are, I believe, holding it to 1.5, making sure we have frequent reviews of promises, and a mechanism to ratchet up the promises over and over again so that we get an accelerating level of reductions in greenhouse gases, combined with the financing to assist developing countries, adaptation funds for developing countries, and as much as possible, since the treaty doesn't take effect till 2020, one of the other concerns that a lot of us have is how much can we push action so that we achieve the things we said we would do in 2009 in Copenhagen, which Canada hasn't done. So action before 2020 is really going to matter. We can't leave this to start at 2020 and then achieve targets. We need to move faster and earlier. And of course, the whole agreement needs to be legally binding, and that's still on the table, and I believe that will be possible.
You think there's some prospect that the emission reduction targets themselves would be legally binding in this treaty?
No, the emission reduction targets are not housed in the treaty. So the emission reduction targets themselves are, and that's one of the questions in the text, is are they housed in the UN Secretariat? But they're not going to be listed in the treaty because they are not. And there's a disadvantage to that, obviously, but the advantage is you can have a convention, no, it won't be a convention, an agreement within the Convention on Climate Change. But this Paris Agreement will create, we hope, the mechanism to keep increasing the targets, and the targets will be probably housed within the UN Secretariat, so that if they were in the treaty, you'd have to open up the treaty every time you wanted to increase a target. If this was the set of targets that would commit us to going to 3.7 degrees, I'd be out here saying we've got to stop this treaty. I want to get this treaty to happen so that we have a mechanism to keep increasing the level of ambition, because as it currently stands, this would be like a death sentence for the planet. If 3.7 is where we're going, then it's game over. So and I say that because the risks of hitting the tipping points into, and I know that's not a scientific term, but runaway global warming is a real threat, where the amount of emissions that we've already put in the atmosphere, we are already seeing what are called positive feedback loops. So as an area dries out, when you have significant drought, you increase the risk of forest fire. Very obviously you do. When forests burn, they release carbon. Or when we warm the Arctic, as we are already doing, and the Arctic in Canada is warming at 3 times the rate of the planetary rate of warming. You melt permafrost, and permafrost, when it melts, releases vast quantities of methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. So that's not all of them, but those are just examples of feedback loops. We want to make sure that we arrest warming at no more than 2 and preferably 1.5 to avoid putting ourselves into an area where 3.7 becomes 4, becomes 5, becomes 6, becomes 7, becomes 8, where it self-accelerates beyond the ability of human societies and economies to make any difference anymore. So that's why when we talk about running out of time, that's what we're talking about. Holding temperature levels lower, not because that's a level that's safe, but because it's safer than allowing us to risk runaway global warming.
Now, I know you're running out of time, and I appreciate that you took the opportunity to speak to me today.
It's great to see you.
But it's great to see you. But I want to conclude with a question of a more philosophical nature, if I might. Sure. During the campaign, the most recent federal election campaign, a number of preeminent activists came out with something called the LEAP Manifesto. Yeah. And you spoke positively about the LEAP Manifesto.
Yeah, we were the only political party to endorse the LEAP Manifesto. Yeah.
So my question to you is, that manifesto, I think, fairly can be described to raise questions about whether we can deal effectively with the climate crisis within a capitalist economy. Mm-hmm. What are your views about that? Do you think that we can preserve the foundations of the capitalist economy that we currently have and deal effectively with the climate crisis?
Well, I guess my question would be around your words, as we currently have. The problem isn't capitalism. The problem is corporate rule. That's the problem. When corporations have more power than governments, that's the problem. When capitalism is constrained by a set of rules and regulations that keep greed in its place, then and not every capitalist society or not every successful business is driven by greed. But when you allow corporate profits to drive government policy, and when you allow corporations to rewrite our laws, as in the previous government, corporate advice rewrote our Fisheries Act. Like literally, they decided that there should be 3 kinds of fish: commercial fish, aboriginal fish, and recreational fish. And if a fish wasn't any of those things, well, we didn't care about protecting its habitat. This is outrageous stuff. This was just like what the Bush administration did, inviting industry in to rewrite the laws. So you can have, I believe, you can have the form of a business that's a co-op. A co-op can make profits. That's in fact what the co-op wants to do, is make profits. So it's not capitalism that's the problem. It's corporate rule that's the problem. And that's a matter of we have to untangle untangle the Gordian knot of globalized trade agreements that are not any longer about trade. They're about corporate rule. They're about being able to say, if you do something in your country that hurts our profits, we're going to sue you. And these are the class of agreements called investor state agreements, or sometimes called FIPAs, foreign investor protection agreements. They are dangerous, they're corrosive to democracy. We should be removing them or replacing them with something that protects corporations from real expropriation, but doesn't give corporations the rights to sue governments when they think their profits are being, or their expectation of profits are being damaged by something a government is passing in a democratic society to protect our health, our environment, our labor laws, and so on. So, yeah, I agree with most. I mean, like, I'm 99% in agreement with Naomi Klein on everything she says, except that I don't think we need to remove capitalism. We need to restore democracy's ability as nation states to say to corporations, you follow these rules, or you know what, we're going to unplug your corporate charter. Yeah, it's the only time in which I actually like the idea of capital punishment, since I'm against capital punishment. But a corporation that violates, like Exxon, like, they knew about climate crisis, they knew it was coming, and they spent tens of millions of dollars to try to mislead the public about it through lies. Corporate criminality. Pull the plug. Let their investors and shareholders see what it's like to have a criminal organization where you've put your savings. Let's pull the plug on corporate illegality, but that isn't an indictment of capitalism. That's an indictment of governments surrendering the tools of civilization in the interests of corporate overlords.
Well, I know you got to go, and I've got to go, in fact, to a public trial of Exxon. So,
What a segue. I didn't even know.
thank you very much for taking time
Thanks,
to talk to us
Dimitri.
today. Okay, Elizabeth. And this is Dimitri Lascaris for The Real News.